The Beatles and Pink Floyd are an example of two groups that were simultaneously so different yet so comparable. Both monumental in British music, these iconic acts reshaped the landscape of rock and roll. Their first chance encounter, however, left a lot to be desired. Hi, I'm Adam, welcome back to Music Mongoose. The Beatles' musical journey began on radio stations as early as 1962 with their debut hit, Love Me Do. What a banger. In contrast, Pink Floyd, initially led by art student Syd Barrett, emerged later in the decade. Nevertheless, the Beatles' influence reverberated profoundly. Their breakthrough in America and their appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show in 1964 sparked inspiration for every British musician who witnessed it, launching the trajectories of many musical careers. The Rolling Stones, the Kinks, Small Faces, the Yardbirds, the Who, the list goes on. They'd all find success in the so-called British invasion, all kicked off by the Beatles. Despite their considerable differences, both bands, like many of their contemporaries, shared similar roots. Roger Waters acknowledges the Beatles' impact on Pink Floyd, citing common inspirations such as early blues legends Huddie Ledbetter and Bessie Smith, jazz, and protest music in general. What set the Beatles apart was their fearless approach to sing about anything they desired. They approached music with an experimental nuance. Roger Waters would learn the importance of writing from personal experience and the value of artistic freedom from the Beatles. He once explained, "I learned from John Lennon and Paul McCartney and George Harrison that it was okay for us to write about our lives and what we felt, and to express ourselves. That we could be free artists, and that there was a value in that freedom, and there was." Waters conscientiously delved into the works of the Beatles during his early years, gaining invaluable insights into the fundamentals of songwriting. The serendipitous encounter between the two bands occurred on March 21st, 1967 at Abbey Road Studios in London. Pink Floyd was working on their debut, Piper at the Gates of Dawn, while the Beatles were recording what would become the acclaimed Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Recording in adjacent studios, Studio 2 for the Beatles, Studio 3 for Pink Floyd, their paths intersected. Piper at the Gates of Dawn, we were doing that in number 3 studio at Abbey Road, and the Beatles were doing Sgt. Pepper's in number 2, Roger Waters once said. And it's all thanks to a chap named Norman Smith. Now, Norman had previously been a studio engineer for the Beatles before moving on to produce songs for Pink Floyd. He was the magic key for their meeting. Nice one, Norm. Hunter Davies, a writer who happened to be there at the time, recalls the whole episode like this. "A man in a purple shirt called Norman arrived. He used to be one of their recording engineers and now had a group of his own, the Pink Floyd. Very politely, he asked George Martin if his boys could possibly pop in to see the Beatles at work. George smiled unhelpfully. Norman said perhaps he should ask John personally, as a favour. George Martin said no, that wouldn't work. But if by chance he and his boys popped in about 11 o'clock, he might just be able to see what he could do." Norman Smith's request to George Martin allowed Pink Floyd to observe the Beatles in their natural habitat in the recording studio. Pink Floyd's drummer Nick Mason described the whole thing like this. "We were ushered into Studio 2 where the Fab Four were busy recording Lovely Rita. The music sounded wonderful and incredibly professional. We sat humbly and humbled at the back of the control room while they worked on the mix. And after a suitable period of time had elapsed, we were ushered out again. They were godlike figures to us." Although this experience was incredible for Pink Floyd, Roger Waters was left a little bit disappointed when he actually spoke to John Lennon. We'll get more onto that in a bit. For now though, it's important to understand that far beyond mere awe at the Beatles' recording process, Pink Floyd absorbed something transformative on this day. And the connection between the two bands became evident as Pink Floyd's music actually took on a Beatlesque quality. Inspired by the Sgt. Pepper's album, Pink Floyd's Piper at the Gates of Dawn, especially the track Power Talk H, echoed the psychedelic style found in Lovely Rita, the very song they were lucky enough to see being recorded. Were Pink Floyd directly inspired by that experience? Both albums manifested into psychedelic masterpieces, solidifying that shared influence. Tragically, of course, the Beatles disbanded altogether just a few years later. Pink Floyd continued for another decade. before eventually facing internal strife between Roger Waters and David Gilmour. Gilmour assumed control in the late 1980s, leading to Pink Floyd's ultimate end. Despite sporadic reunions, Waters and Gilmour's feuding still persists today, signalling the end of an era for Pink Floyd. I've made an entire video about the Pink Floyd feud, by the way, right up to where it began, all the way to the petty squabbling that still persists between Waters and Gilmour today. You can click the card up there to watch that. Now, considering the Beatles' guarded privacy during this era, they had stopped doing live shows, they were a studio-only band, it's quite significant that Pink Floyd actually got to witness this. One could even argue that this moment set Pink Floyd on the right path. Once in awe of the Beatles, Pink Floyd evolved into a force in music in their own right, becoming one of the most influential and successful bands of all time. Maybe it's an over-exaggeration, but the importance of inspiration can't be understated in music. It is transformative. The Beatles, for one, would not exist if it weren't for Elvis's Heartbreak Hotel, according to Lennon. Similarly, groups like the Rolling Stones can accredit their success to inspiration from Chuck Berry and similar artists. And of course, like Pink Floyd, there are tons of groups who can trace back their roots to the Beatles and the inspiration that came from them. Beach Boys, Black Sabbath, Kiss, the Pixies, Nirvana, Oasis, the list goes on, as you know. Inspiration is a hugely powerful thing in music. Could this one chance encounter in Abbey Road Studios have been the spark for Pink Floyd that would too set them on the path of success? Now, before we go on, just a very quick, very friendly reminder to please press the like button below if you're enjoying the video, and also to subscribe to keep up to date with my future videos. Doing this will really help me out here on YouTube, just a lowly ex-radio presenter trying to share his nerdy love of music to YouTube. So like and subscribe below, thanks. Back to it then. In 2015, Waters named Lennon and McCartney among his favourite songwriters of all time. There are certain groups whose names you can just pluck out of the air, and songwriters. Like you can say John Lennon is an important songwriter, as is Paul McCartney, he commented. Unfortunately, their encounter in Abbey Road Studios would be the only time his path crossed with Lennon. Speaking on Mark Maron's WTF podcast, Waters reflected on the whole episode. "I only met John Lennon once, to my huge regret, and that was in the control room number 2. And he was quite snotty. So was I." Pink Floyd were relatively unknown at the time and had yet to release their debut album, which perhaps explains Lennon's lack of warmth towards the group. I mean, think about it. Imagine you were John Lennon in 1967. You were in the Beatles. You're huge, you're massive, you're a global phenomenon. And this random band that you've never heard of comes waltzing in, looking and gawping at you through the glass while you're trying to record an album. I mean, I'd be pretty snotty as well, to be honest. However, of course, this encounter didn't stop Roger Waters from admiring the Beatles, and actually, Sgt. Pepper became one of the most important albums in his life. In fact, Roger Waters once told radio station KLCS how he pulled into a lay-by when Sgt. Pepper's was released. Someone was playing it on the radio in the car. He pulled into a lay-by and listened to the whole thing, just in silence with his mouth open in awe. Again, that's the sort of transformational power that inspiration can have. Now, another chance encounter that led to musical greatness was when David Bowie and Queen happened to be working in the same studios as well. What resulted was maybe one of the world's greatest pop songs. You can click the video here to find out all about that, and I'll catch you next time on Music Mongoose. Alrighty then, bye bye!